Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Wildlife Society webinar series. This month it's hosted by the Invasive Species Working Group. My name is Jenny Ketterlin. I'm the current chair for the Invasive Species Working Group, and I'm going to give just a quick intro to our working group to start us off here. Okay, the purpose of our working group is to provide networking, education, and outreach opportunities for those interested or working in the invasive species community. And we do have a website on the TWS website with a lot of great information. And as you can see here, email address right here and the website address. And you can also follow us on our Facebook page. And the working group, the Invasive Species Working Group, was established in 2010, and we do address animal and plant issues in relation to invasive species. We have about 140 members from 40 states and territories in 6 different countries, so we're a very diverse working group. And our primary goals for this upcoming year are to increase membership participation and to support student attendance at the annual conference. So we are hoping to have a good presence at the conference this year and support some students who want to give presentation on invasive species. And also on our website, you can find copies of our newsletter, which has a lot of great information on all kinds of invasive species issues throughout the country. And with that, I'm going to turn us over to Sue soon to give us a presentation on what the Lacey Act is and isn't, and how we use it to prevent invasions of injurious wildlife. And Sue Jewell will be giving the presentation. She's one of our current board members on the Invasive Species Working Group. She's also the Injurious Wildlife Listing Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and has been in that position since 2010. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Biology from the University of Vermont and a Master of Science degree in Systematics and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Connecticut. Her professional career started at the Savannah River Ecology Lab studying wood storks, which had just been listed as an endangered species. After that, she continued with research on wading birds in the Everglades with the National Audubon Society. Also in the Everglades, she worked on wading birds and alligators at Everglades National Parks Research Center. Then Sue moved to the Northern Everglades, where she was senior biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. An opportunity arose to work on endangered species listing for the Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters in Washington, D.C. Then Sue was persuaded to switch to Injurious Wildlife listing, which she found to be such an important but underappreciated program of the service that she stayed on to give it the needed attention. Her goal has been to bring awareness of this powerful authority for preventing invasions of wildlife. Sue is the national expert on injurious wildlife. She coordinates the writing of regulations to list species as injurious, thus prohibiting the importation of such wildlife species as pythons and freshwater fish from other continents. She provides analysis and recommendations on current and emerging invasive species issues at the national and international levels. And finally, Sue is a certified wildlife biologist and a board member of TWS's Invasive Species Working Group. And so with that, Sue, would you like to take it away?
Yes, you can see my slides, I hope.
You can, yep.
Okay, then I'm ready to go. Thank you, Jenny. Okay, so I would like to thank the Wildlife Society for giving me this opportunity to make this presentation, and I want to thank everybody who's online watching. My goal is to leave you with an understanding of what injurious wildlife listing is and how important it is for preventing wildlife invasions. I am the Injurious Wildlife Listing Coordinator for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is the only agency that has the authority under Congress to list species as injurious. I've been in this position, as Jenny said, since 2010, and I had often heard people outside of the agency characterizing injurious listing as failures or ineffective. Their idea of a failure was that we listed species after they became invasive, like the silver carp, the Burmese python, and the northern snakehead, and therefore listing can't do much good. But I didn't agree with that, but I didn't have any way of showing it. We had never done an analysis of the effectiveness of injurious wildlife listing. And so I set out to do that. I wanted to quantify the effectiveness of listing, and I have a paper that I came out with Pam Fuller from the USGS as my co-author. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our results. But before Pam and I started our analysis, I had to understand the history of injurious wildlife listing, which started in 1900, so that I could document the effectiveness consistently over more than a century. I'm going to explain what I consider success and failure and effectiveness along with the history. So today's program is, what is the Lacey Act and why do I put it in quotation marks? What is injurious wildlife? What species are listed as injurious? How effective is injurious listing? In other words, does listing keep invasive species from becoming established? And last but not least, what does injurious wildlife have to do with the COVID pandemic? Keep you waiting for that one. So what is the Lacey Act and why do I have it in quotes? In the late 1800s, US Representative John Lacey of Iowa listened to the Department of Agriculture's reports of two major problems that were happening to the United States natural resources. So he introduced a bill that addressed both problems, and it became known as the Lacey Act, despite the name not being on the bill. So what was the Lacey Act? So it was the first major national conservation statute passed in 1900. And again, this resulting act, which had no name, it was the way things were done back in the 1900s, I guess. It had no name, not like we have Endangered Species Act of 1973. So two of the problems that Lacey saw were that people were importing birds and mammals for various reasons and releasing them into the wild without consideration of the repercussions. So the act in 1900 said to regulate the introduction of American or foreign birds or animals in localities where they have not heretofore existed. A couple words I want to point out about this language. It says American or foreign, and that does mean that we can list native species. It has been the case since 1900, and that has not changed. But in general, the vast majority of them are foreign birds. I'm sorry, foreign species. Now it also says birds or animals, and the animals is kind of an unusual way of wording it, but it wasn't then. Back then, in 1900, animals meant mammals. And so that is how it is used. And I may switch between animals if I'm quoting something or mammals if I'm paraphrasing. So the second bullet was saying that this was primarily to stop the importation of wild mammals and birds that were harming American agriculture and injurious and wildlife. So what was happening was that people were importing things for various reasons, like the European starling and the English sparrow were being imported by people who wanted to have the same birds that they Shakespeare would have seen in his time, because these were birds that were from England. So they imported them and they became highly invasive. They established actually pretty locally by 1900, but they were wreaking havoc on agriculture. They were eating grains, seeds, and fruits. And agriculture was a booming part of the economy in the late 1800s. And so anything that really caused harm to agriculture was a big problem in the United States. So that is why one of the purposes was to stop these importations. What I just flashed on the screen is 18 U.S. Code 42, also known as Title 18. That is what injurious wildlife is currently known as. It's under this statute. There is no official Lacey Act, and I'm going to show you how the two parts of it started in the same place in the bill that was nicknamed the Lacey Act, and they diverged. So the 18 from Title 18 comes from 18 U.S. Code. So I'm going to be using Title 18 a lot in this presentation. The word injurious is another old term that was used at that time for anything that caused harm, usually to agriculture. It was a very big term in agriculture, harm to livestock, harm to poultry, harm to crops. The other thing that Lacey saw was that people were killing game birds and mammals in violation of one state law and getting away with it by crossing into another state. So Lacey got legislation passed that addressed both issues at the same time. And so the part about the transport of, game in violation of one state into another state, that is now called trafficking. That's in parentheses right here. And that was primarily to protect US native birds and mammals. It's now called 16 US code. And then there's a lot of sections because it's very broad. We also call it Title 16. Again, the 16 refers to 16 US code. And people refer to both of these things as the Lacey Act, but they've been separated out. And I'm going to show you how they differ and where confusion comes because there is some overlap. But I want to point out something very basic. The information on the left, which is about injurious listing, is trying to keep harmful species from other parts of the world out of the United States. The part on the right is conservation for native US species. And that's the big difference. It was trying to protect states that were already looking at conservation, already making laws to prohibit overharvesting, and they were looking at things like the passenger pigeon, which up until the late 1800s was doing okay, but then it started really getting decimated because people were market hunting. Some states started protecting the passenger pigeons and did not allow hunting, but people would go into that state, shoot all they wanted to, and go into the next state where they were not protected. And that was something Lacey saw was something that had to be fixed. So this was a law to help the conservation-minded states to protect their species. So in 1900, the Lacey Act was under the authority of the Department of Agriculture, and the purpose was to protect the interests of agriculture or horticulture from injurious species. What the law actually said was that it shall be unlawful for any person or persons to import into the United States any foreign wild animal or bird, except under special permit from the United States Department of Agriculture. This is a really important sentence that if you gloss over it, you'll miss the point that it actually prohibits any foreign wild mammal or bird from being imported unless it's one of those that gets a permit from the Department of Agriculture. So that was sort of a clean list. I used to call it a white list, but that's such a confusing term. So it's a clean list. Those shipments that are approved for importation, and I say shipments because permits were given for a shipment, which could include multiple species. So there was no clean list for species. It was just case by case for a shipment. And everything else was not allowed to be imported as far as the wild mammals and wild birds. Now, there were some exceptions because agriculture was overseeing this. So there were, it doesn't say anything about agricultural species. So livestock and poultry, things like that, were not covered under this. So they could be imported. So we're talking about wild species. So there was also a dirty list. So there were species, and this is what the 1900 statute said: the importation of the mongoose, the fruit bats, the English sparrow, the starling, or such other birds or animals as the Secretary of Agriculture may from time to time declare injurious, shall be destroyed or returned at the expense of the owner. This was the first injurious species list in 1900, and it was an unconditional prohibition on importation. You could not even get a permit for these. Anything that did show up at a port had to be destroyed or returned. There were no exceptions. And as you'll see, that isn't the way it is now. I'm going to include this slide about transportation because transportation and interstate transport is another source of confusion as far as what the Lacey Act covers. So the 1900 law said that it shall be unlawful for any person to deliver to any common carrier to transport from one state or territory to another state or territory. So there's the interstate transport part. Any foreign wild animals or birds, the importation of which is prohibited, those are the injurious species, or killed in violation of the state. So that's the trafficking part that is protecting states that are trying to be conservation minded. This is all rolled in together in this section. So this is interstate transport, later got separated out. So I can see where there is confusion. I'm including this 1940 amendment because from 1900 to 1940, as I said, the Department of Agriculture was responsible for injurious listing, but a reorganization of the federal government in 1939 transferred the authority to the new Fish and Wildlife Service in 1940. I say new Fish and Wildlife Service because that's when we were officially started. So the reason I'm including this is because when I was trying to figure out how do I consistently evaluate injurious listing from 1900 until when I was starting a few years ago on the evaluation, I did not think it was appropriate to include the first 40 years. We only had responsibility as the Fish and Wildlife Service from 1940. So that's where we started our evaluation. There were some major amendments to injurious wildlife in 1960. For one, Congress amended the so-called Lacey Act by adding taxa that could be designated as injurious. Remember, up till now, it was just wild birds and wild mammals. Now, we could list fishes, mollusks, crustaceans, reptiles, and amphibians if we determined that they could also be injurious. Congress also added more categories of interests that could be affected as justification for designating species. Before, it was just if a species could cause harm to agriculture or horticulture, because that was how it started with the Department of Agriculture. But Congress added these other justifications, which is injury to human beings, to forestry, or wildlife resources of the United States. So this is interesting because for 20 years, from 1940 to 1960, we couldn't list anything that caused harm to wildlife or wildlife resources, and we were the Fish and Wildlife Service. So this was a good addition. But you'll also notice that it says injury to human beings, and this has been in here since 1960. If something causes injury to human beings, we could have listed it since then. And we have always looked at what harm might come to human beings, but we've never listed anything specifically for that. It's always been in addition to the harm that could be caused to wildlife or wildlife resources. And I want to mention here that when we say injurious, it could mean something that's directly harmful, or it could also mean invasive. So for the most part, we have been listing species because of their traits of invasiveness. Direct injury could be something like a highly venomous snake from another continent that could kill a person if it bit the person, and there's no anti-venom in the United States. We could list that as injurious because of the harm it causes. We haven't done that. We've been mostly focused on harm to wildlife or wildlife resources. Another amendment was exceptions under the permit. And like I said before, up until now, there was a unconditional prohibition on injurious wildlife. Anything that was designated as injurious could not be imported for any reason. Now, it could be imported. The exceptions were for zoological, educational, medical, and scientific purposes. So there was no real blanket prohibition. And there was another amendment for the shipment clause rewording that has to do with interstate transport. That's a little more complicated, and I will talk about that later. So what is the Lacey Act now? I'm going to have a few slides that kind of talk about the same thing, might be a little repetitive, but I want to make sure this point gets across that 18 U.S. Code 42, which is injurious wildlife, prohibits the importation into the United States and some transport within the United States, which I'll explain later, of species that are designated as injurious wildlife. And as I said, as of 1960, there were permit exceptions. Title 16, or the wildlife and plant trafficking part of the so-called Lacey Act, is where law enforcement can assist states and other jurisdictions with intercepting illegal importation and interstate transport of wildlife, species, and plants taken or possessed in violation of state, federal, tribal, or foreign laws. And that's what it is now. There were many amendments to Title 16 along the way. They added some other things, and I'm actually going to show you those because I think it's another source of confusion. But I want to point out here that it requires law enforcement assistance from federal agencies, and our Fish and Wildlife Service has a very large law enforcement office to assist the states with any violations on wildlife and plant trafficking, and with injurious wildlife too. So a little summary of what injurious wildlife is now. It's wild mammals, wild birds, fishes, amphibians, reptiles, mollusks, and crustaceans found through regulation or congressional action to be injurious to the interests of human beings, agriculture, horticulture, forestry, wildlife, or wildlife resources of the United States. So it's all combined now. And as you see, the wild mammals and the wild birds are separate. We don't have any separate categories for the other taxa. Fishes, there's no such thing as a domesticated fish as far as injurious wildlife is concerned. We could list any kind of fish, any kind of amphibian, but that is not true with the mammals and the birds. We're not going to list anybody's dog or cat or things that are commonly considered domesticated for mammals and birds. Okay, and then the next slide is the prohibitions, because they are different. And I want to show you that you don't have to read every word on here. In fact, you don't have to read them at all. But the difference is that Title 18 on the left has very few words, because there's really very little that it prohibits. It prohibits importation and transport between the shipment clause jurisdictions. And I will talk about the shipment clause again, that's later. That's interstate transport. But it doesn't say export, sale, possession, or anything like that. It's really just importation in some shipments. But if you look at Title 16, I summarized it. There's really a lot more to it. It's very broad. It covers that it's unlawful to import, to export, to sell, acquire, purchase, or purchase fish, wildlife, or plants that are taken, possessed, transported, or sold in violation of any law, treaty, or regulation. This is very, very broad. And this is where most of the violations under the so-called Lacey Act happen. It's right here. I will say that a violation of Title 18 just by itself is very rare. Usually there's something else that's going on at the same time an injurious species is being imported or transported that overlaps with Title 16, that brings in Title 16 and makes it both a Title 18 and a Title 16 violation. So if, for example, somebody was importing, let's say somebody was, I'm going to keep this simple, simple Title 18 violation would be, let's say somebody in Canada was driving across the border into the United States with a pet Burmese python, let's say. Okay, Burmese pythons are listed as injurious. The person was importing it, and that was a violation of Title 18. But if that person didn't lie about what he or she had when that person came into customs or across the border. There was no lying. There was nothing like a transaction going on where that person was going to give it or sell it to someone else. It was just this person's own Burmese python. Okay, that is just a basic Title 18 violation, and it's actually pretty minor. It's a misdemeanor. But if that person lied to customs, lied on the declaration form, or sold it to somebody else across the border, or anything like that, it could pull in a Title 16 violation, and that has stricter, higher penalties. There's a variety of different penalties. So that's where there's overlap, and I can see that there's confusion. Okay, so I'm going to show you some other confusing things. So amendments adding taxa of organisms. I already told you about Title 18 in 1960, that for these foreign species, we could list fishes, reptiles, amphibians, mollusks, and crustaceans. Generally speaking, they're foreign species, but we could designate them as injurious. And that was as of 1960, and it's still true. But if you look at Title 16, the trafficking part of the so-called Lacey Act, it wasn't until 1969 that amphibians, reptiles, mollusks, and crustaceans were added. So these were just to protect native species. Keep in mind, this was conservation for native species in the United States, which eventually was also included protecting native species in foreign countries. But look at the difference between 1969, where the conservation law was protecting native species, and 1960, where we could keep them out of the United States. So fishes, if you look here, fishes were not added until 1981, and that's when plants were added. And then in 2008, trees and plant parts were added. So there is a difference between these, and you have to keep them straight. Which one is for Title 18 and which one is for Title 16? I've seen papers come out that were published and peer-reviewed that said we could not designate fishes as injurious until 1981, and they didn't do their homework. So, okay, so now we're getting away from the history, and now what about injurious wildlife now? How are species listed as injurious? Congress can amend the statute, and they have done so 4 times since the original law in 1900. In 1990, Congress listed the zebra mussel as injurious. In 1991, Congress listed the brown tree snake. In 2010, Congress listed the bighead carp, and Congress listed the quagga mussel in 2018. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, all of these were already highly invasive by the time Congress listed them, and you would be right. So we, the Fish and Wildlife Service, can also list by rule promulgation, which is making a regulation, by using risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. I want to explain that we go through the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a standard way of making rules by federal agencies in the United States. We go through all the standard procedures. We follow all of the required determinations. We do risk assessments. We do evaluations for injuriousness. It's quite complicated. And if anybody ever tells you that the service can list something very quickly, I read something where it said that we might be able to list something in 24 hours. It is so not true. It takes a long time to get something listed, especially if we go through the proposed rule process, which is public comment, peer review. It could take a couple of years. We interim rule for some salamanders to prevent a fungus from entering the United States. Interim rule, which was basically our version of emergency listing, because we don't have the authority to emergency list under 18 U.S. Code 42. We could use, under the APA, we could use an interim rule. It took us 14 months to do that very important rule. So it is a long process. And we do go through a lot of evaluations. So now you might want to know what species are listed as injurious. I can't show all of the species because there are almost 800 of them, so I'm giving you a summary here. I'm summarizing by taxa, not really by classes, because mollusks are in a class and crustaceans are in a class, but the others are. Wild mammals, wild birds, again, it's just part of a class. So the middle column is the number of species, and the middle column is for all. And what that means is all of the species in that category. So there were 96 species of wild mammals that we have listed. The column on the right is the number of species that we used in the analysis. So remember I said we're just looking at invasiveness. We were trying to evaluate the effectiveness of listing for invasiveness. So that's why I cut out two big groups. If you notice that the fishes and the amphibians have a big difference between all the species that were listed and just the ones in the analysis. So for example, the 228 salmonids, these are in the family Salmonidae. The entire family Salmonidae, we listed not because the salmon, the trout, the chard, anything in that family was injurious, but they can be hosts to a pathogen that can make the host injurious. We cannot list pathogens. And so the only way that we can sort of get around that is by listing the host, because the host is injurious by virtue of it carrying a pathogen that can be transmitted to other fish. And in the United States, and of course in Canada too, our salmonid industry, the salmon fisheries, both the wild fisheries and the aquaculture, are very important to our economy. So we have to protect them. And as far as the salamanders, we had not listed any other salamanders as injurious, but we did list 20 genera of salamanders in 2016 because of the risk that they could be hosts of a fungus that was killing salamanders in Europe. And so I could not figure out how to include those in the same way for the analysis. There just was no way to be consistent. It was an entirely different circumstance. So in the long run, out of the 785 species listed as injurious, I'm only using 307 in the analysis. I also want to point out here that this number can change at any time. Any of you that have worked with the taxonomy of species knows that it's always evolving. There's new genomic information happening. There are always species being discovered, especially in remote areas, which is particularly relevant for us because most of our species are foreign species and they do come from remote areas. They do come from remote areas of Africa, maybe Asia and South America. And so there are always species being discovered. There are species that have been split, one species into two species or two subspecies, elevated into separate species. So names changing. So there are, the numbers are changing, but I do want to say that I think I will be able to show you better with the next slide. What I want to say is that it doesn't matter if the species are changing within a genus. This slide is showing how many times we've listed an entire genus or an entire family. We have been trying to be proactive, or as I like to say, preemptive in our listing by listing something before it became established. And we've been doing that since our first rule in 1952. That was our first rule. And we've done it many times since then. So I wanted to show you here that we have listed 11 genera, the entire genus for each of those 11. We have listed 2 families, the complete family, Clariidae and Shanidae, the walking catfish and the snakehead. And I'm showing you on the column on the right, how many species within that taxa, that genus or that family, was established at the time of listing. And there are very few, and some of them, in some cases, there are no species that were already established at listing at the time were established at the time we listed it. So what I was going to say before, and I'll say now, is that in any of these categories, these taxa that we have listed, whether it be the 7 genera of the mongooses, or all of the fruit bats, or all of the mitten crabs, it doesn't matter if the taxonomy within that genus or family changes. We have written into the regulation that everything is covered as long as it's in that family or in that genus. So we have tried to cover our bases there. So now you're wondering how many species were established at the time of listing, because as I just showed you, there weren't that many that were established at the time of listing. So I'm showing you here all the species, and this is not a summary, this is all the species that were established in the United States at the time they were listed as injurious. And there are only 19. I may surprise you because you hear about the so-called failures a lot. You know some of these species. You know black carp, silver carp, bighead carp, zebra mussel, quagga mussel. You know the Burmese python and the snakeheads, things like that. You hear about them all the time, and that's why people think that the injurious wildlife listings are a failure, because they're a horrible problem all over the United States, and we know that. But there really weren't that many that we listed after it was too late. Some of these you may have never heard of. You may have never heard of the red whiskered bulbul, or the Java sparrow, or I don't know. The zander is one. You may not have heard of it. Probably if you are from North Dakota, you have. I put that in there because the state of North Dakota considers it established. It is in one lake, Spiritwood Lake in North Dakota. And at the time we listed it, it was only in that one lake. So I considered it established because North Dakota did. Since then, there has been some flooding, and I understand that some zander may have gotten into another drainage, but nevertheless, I included it with established populations. I did not want to be considered, biased or something, or try to squeeze something in that really wasn't established. So there are only 19. So remember before, it was 307 species that we used in the evaluation that we listed because they were invasive, and 9 that were already established. That leaves 288 species that we listed before they were established, and they were not established at the time of listing. That's 94% of the species that are listed as injurious. So you're probably wondering what has happened to those 288 species. And surprisingly, none of those species have established since then. We do have reports from Puerto Rico that possibly 2, the reticulated python and another species of walking catfish, there are reports of them. We haven't gotten confirmation yet that they have established. I have a feeling we will get that at some point, in which case there'll be 2 out of the 288 species. So it really doesn't throw my percentage off. We're calling it 100% prevention right now. So we have prevented 100% of those species from being imported. I do want to make it very clear that we don't claim entire responsibility for stopping these species. We know that there are other reasons that species can be imported and weren't. For example, perhaps there was no pathway for them. Perhaps nobody was going to import it anyway. Perhaps states have stepped up and made regulations that somehow prevented anybody from wanting to import them, prevented the trade. There are other reasons, but what I feel is appropriate to say is that we have no failures. The reason I say this is while other people may be saying that a failure is when we listed a species after it was already established, I say a failure is when we listed a species before it established and then it became established. That means that the listing was ineffective. And that is what I would call a failure. And that is why I'm saying, for whatever reason, we don't see any failures, except for maybe the two in Puerto Rico. And those two cannot be transported to any other part of the United States. So hopefully, if they do get confirmed as established, it will only be in Puerto Rico, which I hope they can eradicate. So why should we list established species? One of the reasons is to provide an example of why the congeners or the confamilials should also be listed if they share the same traits. When I showed you that we listed the whole family of snakeheads, but we knew that there were already 3 snakeheads that were established, and we already knew that there was some walking catfish that were established. When people see the harm that the northern snakehead caused, and even though we listed them after it was basically too late, they certainly have spread since then, what people can see is the harm that that species has caused. And we listed the entire family of snakeheads, which is now up to something like 57, and they all share the same traits of injuriousness. So we think that the public can see what we did by stopping the whole family. So it does some good in that case to show, to have something, certainly we wouldn't want to allow something to get established and then listed. We would always try to stop it. So another reason for listing established species is to reduce the opportunity for individuals to enter new areas of the country that they wouldn't otherwise access. Another reason is to reduce the opportunity for diseased or particularly hardy individuals to be imported, and that's the propagule pressure, if you're familiar with that term. And another reason is to provide technical information to states and other jurisdictions that may be considering regulations of their own. States can make much more stringent regulations than we can, and they have. And some states have already adopted part, or I don't know, maybe even all of our listed species for their regulations. I know Florida has some that they have adopted from our list. Ohio has, Illinois has, and I'm sure there are other states that have adopted some species from our list. And the good thing about our list that could help the states is that we have gone through this vetting process. We have gone through the public review process and shown to the public what harm these species can cause if they are introduced into the environment. We have, in some cases, modeling and risk assessments that the states may not have, or they don't have the resources to do it. They can use any of our stuff. It's free to use for the public. We have some of our risk assessments posted on the internet. So, and another advantage is that a state agency can say to their lawmakers, look, the federal Fish and Wildlife Service has listed this. And so, hopefully we can do the same thing. So there is that advantage. And then another one is to inform the public of the harm that the species can cause if acquired as a pet or for other purposes. This is not a reason to list something. In fact, a lot of these are not reasons to list something, but it does give us support for why listing established species can do some good. If somebody was looking at, let's say some parents were looking at getting a pet for their child, and the child wants a Burmese python, Well, if they read a little bit about Burmese python and they see that we consider it injurious and they read about why they may decide, okay, we don't want to do that, let's find a less risky species. And so there is that advantage. And there may be other reasons for listing established species. I'm just listing some. So, and here's the point. With all these reasons to list established species, it seems unwarranted to call them failures. So where other people are calling established species failures, I am saying, well, no, I think that there are reasons for doing this. So that's it for injurious wildlife, specifically about injurious wildlife. I'm going to go now to interstate transport and see if I can make this as unconfusing as possible. So the 1960 amendment said this, and it's a whole long explanation of what is the prohibition for importation. And it says the importation into the United States, into any territory of the United States, into the District of Columbia, into the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or any possession of the United States, or any shipment between the continental United States. Oops, I should have highlighted states. The District of Columbia, Hawaii, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or any possession of the United States is hereby prohibited. And the latter clause that I highlighted in yellow is known as the shipment clause. And there's a reason for that because we got sued on that. So I'm highlighting here between the continental United States because that is how the Fish and Wildlife Service interpreted the interstate transport for several decades. We considered the continental United States as 49 states on the continent, that shipment between any of those states, between, Maryland and Virginia, between Illinois and Indiana, Louisiana, Texas, whatever, or any states, from California to New York, that we considered that to be prohibited because it was between the continental United States. We got sued on that, and you don't need to read what this says. I just wanted to put a graphic in. We did get sued in 2013. It went to an appeals court, and we got the decision on April 7th of 2017. This is about the interstate transport. We were sued on other things. We did not lose on them. The only thing that there was a decision against us on was the interstate transport. And so as of 2017, this court's decision is in effect. And I'm just going to read the part in the yellow that what the court decided was that it prohibits the shipment of injurious species between the listed jurisdictions, including to and from the continental United States, but it does not speak to shipments between the 49 continental United States. So it's treating the 49 continental United States as one block. It's separating here the word continental from states. In other words, the word united is not in there. It's saying that there are 49 states on the continent, and it doesn't say that there is that shipment between those states is prohibited. It basically is calling the 49 continental states one block, despite the fact that Alaska is not really one block with the rest of the 48 states, but that is the way the court interpreted it. So I'm going to try to make this somewhat simple if I can. So what it's saying is that the 49 continental states are one unit within which injurious species can be transported without a permit. But the District of Columbia, which is not a state, and it's not Hawaii, and it's not one of the territories, but it's not a state. So even though it's on the continent, it's not a state. That is separated so that you cannot ship or transport between the District of Columbia and the state of Maryland, or vice versa, Maryland into the District of Columbia or to Virginia, nor can you drive from Maryland to Virginia by going through the District of Columbia with an injurious listed species, unless you have a permit. A little confusing there, but that's what it says. And so the District of Columbia is separate and the territories are not states, and Hawaii is not on the continent, so they are all separate. So shipment from one to another of these other jurisdictions is prohibited without a permit. So you can't go between Guam and Puerto Rico, or Guam and California, or Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, or the District of Columbia, and any of those. So there have been bills introduced into Congress that have tried to clarify that it should be prohibited, this interstate transport, trying to put this back into what we thought it was. They haven't gotten anywhere. So right now there is no prohibition on interstate transport as I have described. So last subject is, how is injurious listing relevant to the COVID pandemic? So a year ago, Congress passed and the president signed the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, also known as the COVID Relief Bill. It was a very broad bill to address relief to all aspects of the American public, because basically everything was affected. So how could the COVID relief bill work to prevent something from like this happening again? And where do we fit in? Well, you may recall that Congress put harm to human beings as a reason that we can list species as injurious. We have never done it strictly for harm to humans, but in that whole large bill, there's this little paragraph that says United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and yes, it's called Lacey Act provisions. And I will admit, to their credit, it's both Title 18 and Title 16 are included, because there are reasons to use aspects of both of those provisions of the law to prevent wildlife from being imported into the United States that might cause a similar pandemic. I'm sure you all know that the COVID-19 was most likely, it was a bat or a wildlife species that was the host that transferred it to humans, and about 40% of infectious diseases in humans are caused by wildlife that are hosts of pathogens. So there is a lot of reason to be looking at this. And because we already had the authority under the Lacey Act to list wildlife species as injurious if they cause harm to humans, we got put into the COVID relief bill. And this is the first time in what was 121 years that we have ever gotten funding for listing species as injurious. And yikes, we got $10 million. It sounds like a lot of money. It's being split many different ways. Some of it has to go to international affairs for the work that they do with the permits for injurious wildlife. Some of it has to go to law enforcement because they have port inspectors and there needs to be more port inspections. There's a lot involved with this. We have already doled out $1.25 million for an interagency agreement for a massive global horizon scanning to look for wildlife species from around the world that may be carrying a pathogen or a parasite that could be transported by that wildlife into the United States and cause a pandemic in the future. It's a large task for us to do, and I'm looking forward to it. Like I said, we've already started with this global horizon scanning that we have given an interagency agreement on, and we are going to have to hire more people. If you think that it's easy for us to add all this work into what we're doing now, the truth is that there is only one person doing injurious wildlife listing, and you're looking at her. So we definitely need more help. So that is basically it. And this last slide here has 2 publications on injurious wildlife. I'll leave that up. And then I guess Jenny will tell me if there are any questions. And I want to thank everybody right now. Thank you for listening.